an Extension Horse Quest live webcast on forage and horses, why it's important, and what are the options. The presenter for this evening is Dr. Karen Waite. Karen is an Extension equine specialist in Michigan and teaches and advises equine students in the Michigan State University Department of Animal Science. In her extension roles, she coordinates the Adult Equine Extension Program, the Michigan Equine Survey, and is the Director of Leadership Development for My Horse University. In addition, she oversees the Youth Equine Extension Program and is active with eXtension HorseQuest. Her teaching responsibilities include a variety of equine courses, and she coaches the Michigan State horse judging team. She is also faculty advisor to the MSU equestrian team. Karen oversees the Michigan Forage Pet Program for riders with disabilities. And further, she is president of the American Youth Horse Council and is a carded judge with ABRA. Karen has a bachelor's degree in education and animal science, a master's degree in animal science with a nutrition emphasis, and she recently completed a doctoral degree in sports psychology with an emphasis on equestrian sport and activity. In her spare time, Karen participates in all-around events with her horse Chip and spends time with her husband Tim and their dogs Zoe, Jasper, and Buddha. Please note that you're able to ask questions during the presentation via the text chat on the left side of your screen. And the presentation today is being recorded, and we're going to upload it to our website tomorrow if you'd like to review the talk at a later date or maybe share it with someone else. And at this time, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Dr.
All right, thanks, Gwen. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm excited that we have people from so many different parts of the country, Texas, Washington, Nebraska, so pretty much everywhere. So that's awesome, and hopefully you can hear me okay. If you have any trouble hearing me at this point, just go ahead and type in the chat pod, and we will try to rectify that situation. Helen says she can barely hear. Is that any better? I tried to move the microphone closer to my mouth, and I don't know, I'm not sure, but hopefully everybody else can hear me okay. If you do have trouble, by all means type it in the chat, and Gwen and I will try to sort it out. We'll start out, and I'm going to wait and see what Barry says in regards to if he can hear or not. So then we'll start out. Okay. Hopefully, Helen, you'll be able to turn the volume up some, or I've improved it a little bit with moving the microphone. But I'll try to talk a little louder too. Okay, Barry did turn the volume up a little, so I'll just try to talk louder, and hopefully that helps. All right, so we're going to start out by talking about what forage is, first of all, and why it is, again, as the title suggests, so important to horses' diets. And basically, forage is long stem hay, pasture grass, or legumes, which the pasture grass and legumes are just two different types of plants. But these particular feedstuffs are over 20% crude fiber. And they really should make up at least 50% of a horse's daily intake. It's a critical part of a horse's diet, and we'll talk about why that is as we go through the slides tonight. But horses typically, it's recommended that they consume 1.5 to 3.5% of their body weight in forage of some type, depending on the horse. And so at minimum, that constitutes 12 to 15 pounds per day per horse, which again at minimum is about 450 pounds per month per horse. Or if you live in a state like Michigan, which I know several of you don't, but you have a wide range of growing seasons given the areas that you're from. If you live in a place like Michigan where we only have about 9 months or less of good growth as far as pasture goes, we recommend about 150 pound bales per horse per year. And again, depending on the year and depending on the horse, that can change a little bit, but in general, that's a good rule of thumb, and it's really important knowing your area and knowing the kinds of pastures that you have and what you can use in regards to maintaining your horses. It's important that you calculate how much supplemental forage you might need, if any. Some of you may live in areas where you have great pastures year round, but I think almost all of us have experienced some drought in the last couple of years, especially, and for some of you longer than that. So you may need to supplement hay or forage, and that might be why you're on this particular webinar. Forage matters to horses for a variety of reasons, in part because of the digestive tract of the horse and the way it's designed and the way horses are designed, and we'll look at that more closely in just a couple of slides. It also matters as far as the behavior of the horse goes. Horses are innately designed to walk a little bit and move a little bit and then graze or chew a little bit. And so we know that when they are in the wild, that's what they do, and there are no feed stores on the corner typically. So their predominant intake is some form of forage, usually in the form of pasture grass. We also know that when we have horses in domestic situations, and certainly they can be managed well in domestic situations, but if we feed them low fiber, so low hay content diets or low pasture diets and high concentrate or high grain rations, we know that we may see an increased risk of colic, of gastric ulcers, and of wood chewing, and some other behavioral issues as well. Does anybody know, if you could just type in the chat pod, about how long a horse left to its own devices will graze in the wild? Does anybody have a guess on that? And just want to type it in the chat pod? No guesses? Okay, well, I'll just give it away. I don't see that anyone's typing. But left to their own devices, horses will graze about 18 to 20 hours. And if they don't have that option, then they'll find other things to chew on. And so that can be fence posts, that can be trees and tree bark, or that can be one another. So when you have instances of tail chewing and that sort of thing, sometimes that's as a result of not having quite enough fiber in the diet. So moving then to the GI tract, this is a diagram of what the horse's GI tract looks like. And if you look as you face the screen over on your left-hand side, we start with the esophagus coming into the stomach. So down the horse's neck is where the esophagus is, excuse me, and that's about 4.5 feet long. And it comes into the stomach in kind of a funny angle, as you can see there. And that becomes relevant in regards to especially circumstances where there might be a blockage or something. That angle, and as well as the angle in which the esophagus enters or empties into the stomach, as well as a one-way valve that's at the end of the esophagus, makes it very difficult or impossible, to be honest, for a horse to vomit, which would be how most other animals would get rid of something that was causing them GI problems. Horses can't do that, which is one reason that they are prone to colic. And a big part of the reason they can't do that is because of the valve that is at the juncture where the esophagus comes to the stomach. But assuming all is working properly, the esophagus empties the feed into the stomach, and the stomach is really only about 8 to 17 quarts. So given that we're almost into Halloween season, it's about the size of a medium-sized pumpkin or jack-o'-lantern. And feed really only stays in the stomach for about 20 minutes. So the preliminary acid and things that start to digest the feed, those processes happen in the stomach, and then the feed moves into the small intestine. And this diagram doesn't necessarily do it great justice, but the small intestine is about 70 feet long. And at 70 feet, if you think about the fact that a horse's body cavity or abdominal cavity is maybe 3 or 4 feet long, maybe a little bit longer than that, depending on the horse. That small intestine curves or curls back and forth on itself in that cavity. So that's another space where every time that intestine flips back on itself, it forms a little flexure there, and it provides an area where feed can get stuck. And that's what happens with impaction colics. Now, one good thing about high forage diets is forage provides a lot of bulk. And so if you were feeding diets that had a lot of grain, the small intestine would tend to sort of grab around those boluses of grain, whereas if you have long stem forage, that kind of opens up the tract a little bit, and so may increase movement of feed through the tract. In the small intestine is where the majority of digestion takes place of a lot of nutrients, so a lot of things are absorbed through the small intestine. But one thing that isn't absorbed in the small intestine is fiber. And so you can see that the small intestine then empties into the or this goes through or by a blind pouch that's called the cecum. And the cecum is kind of like the rumen of the horse, for lack of a better way to describe it. So there are microbial bugs in the cecum that digest the fiber and that's what allows horses to digest fiber is those microbes that are in the cecum. And so the fiber is then digested, the water is absorbed from the large colon for the most part, and whatever is left at that point is excreted then as manure. So you can see that the large intestine includes the cecum, large colon, small colon, rectum, and anus, and that's about 29 feet. So there's a lot going on in that horse's body cavity. But just to recap, if you have a diet that's high in fiber, which is ideal for the horse, you keep feed moving through the tract, because like we said in the beginning, there's limited stomach capacity, and the feed really only stays there about 20 minutes. And if it's empty, there's acid that sits there as well, which results potentially in that increase in the potential for ulcers. But a high fiber diet will also slow down the rate of passage a bit. The equine GI tract has a fairly rapid rate of passage, but high fiber will slow that down some, and that's beneficial from a nutrient absorption perspective. And then we have a hindgut that contains microbes that help to digest fiber. So why the sudden interest or the interest in the last couple of years in regards to alternative forage sources or alternative fiber sources? For us in the Midwest anyway, and I know that several of you are not from the Midwest, but you've all had your share of weather-related issues, I think. But we had a drought last year that resulted in a roughly 40% reduction in our hay crop. And I know in certain parts of Texas, you've had droughts for years, and so this is something that you've been struggling with for a while. But in Michigan, it was the first year that we really struggled to find hay. And so we had, again, a 40% reduction in the hay crop. We had, in addition to the drought, corn and soy producers that were using some of their hay ground to plant grain because the price of corn and soy was so high. And so we got into a supply and demand situation. And sometimes as horse owners, we don't think about our relationship to other ag commodities and other ag producers, but it's very connected. And so we had a supply and demand problem. And as a result of that, the price of hay went through the roof for us. Fortunately, 2013, at least in the Midwest, has been a much better growing season. As Dr. Skelly has commented in the chat pod, we also had a fair bit of Michigan hay that had been shipped out of state, but at the same time, we also had people in Michigan who were going out of state to get hay. And last year was the first year that that had happened for us. But this year is a better year as far as growing seasons go in most parts of our state, and hopefully in your states as well. I know it varies quite a bit, but what we're looking at in quite a few places now is that good pasture will be gone if it's not already gone in August, September, October. usually the growth of the grass or forage starts to slow down some. We are still seeing hay that's less expensive than last year, but still higher than pre-2011 levels. And depending on what area you're in, there may be some questions in regard to hay quality. Oftentimes in situations of drought or times when hay is hard to come by, people will start to bale whatever they can find. So it may be swamp grass, it may be ditches, and when you do that, you wind up with sometimes more weeds or poor quality plants as compared to good quality grass and legume hay. So what can you do if you find yourself in a situation where you need to try to stretch your hay supply? And that's really the biggest thing to try to emphasize is ideally, for the reasons we've already talked about, you'll try to feed long stem forage in the form of pasture if you have it, or hay if your growing season doesn't allow that. But what can you do if you're in a bind or you're trying to make that long stem forage last a little bit longer or stretch? And one of the ways that that can be done is through the use of hay cubes. So at most local feed stores, you can find cubes that are a combination of either, you can find straight alfalfa cubes, which would be high in protein, high in energy, great for lactating brood mares, great for young horses, um, probably more than a mature horse at maintenance would need in most circumstances, but it would depend a little bit on what they were doing. You can also find cubes that are a mixture of alfalfa and grass, which is pretty common for the mature horse at maintenance, as are straight grass cubes. But they tend to come in all three of those varieties. You want to look at the label and see what you're getting. But basically, it's long stem chopped hay that's been dried and compressed into cubes. And you can replace your long stem hay or supplement your long stem hay 1-to-1. So if you're feeding 12 pounds of long stem hay, you could feed 12 pounds of cubes and it would do essentially the same job for the most part. It would be a little bit different, but you could maybe, if you were feeding 20 pounds a day, you could do 10 pounds of cubes and 10 pounds of hay, and that would make your long stem forage last a little bit longer. I never really thought that I would see the day when that would be an economic thing to do in this state anyway. But last year when we got to about February, the numbers actually did come pretty close. So we had quite a few people that did that. You can use hay cubes as the sole source of fiber, and so that's a plus. And we've discussed the lactating mares and growing horses. You can also use the cubes as a partial substitute. We actually have a broodmare at home who's 28 now, and they started feeding her cubes before the drought, but just to extend the hay because she could do a little better with the cubes, and have just kept her on it. And so she does get about 6 pounds a day. It does stretch the hay a little bit, and so it was effective in that regard, but she's in great shape, and the cubes can be pretty beneficial for older horses. If you've got horses with teeth or dentition problems, you can soak them and they're a little easier to consume. So there are some benefits to hay cubes, but they are also expensive. So that's something to keep in mind. Some of the other issues you might get into with using hay cubes, again, pay attention to the alfalfa versus mixed. If you're feeding a horse mixed hay and you switch to straight alfalfa, that's more protein and energy than, again, a mature horse at maintenance probably needs. So just keep that in mind. It could be very beneficial if you have very poor quality hay that's very fibrous and that's low in protein and energy, and you enhance it a little bit with some alfalfa cubes, but just make sure you know what kind of cubes you have. If you have older horses or horses that tend to bolt their feed, they may have issues with choke. If if they try to bolt the cubes, or they have teeth that make it difficult for them to chew and you don't wet it, they may have an increase in choke. So you want to keep an eye on that as they're starting to get used to the cubes. The cubes don't provide long stem forage. So again, like we said in the beginning, because behaviorally speaking, horses want to chew or have an innate need to chew, the cubes don't take as long to eat. And so once they're done with the cubes, they may look for other things to chew. So that could include wood and whatever else is around. And then again, the economics of it. It can be not terribly economical to feed the cubes depending on the cost of hay in your area. And this just gives you an example of that. When I looked at cubes last fall, they range from $14.99 to $15.79 a bag. And what I would pay close attention to as well is that most of the cubes and a lot of bagged feeds anymore come in 40-pound bags, not 50-pound bags. So make sure you know how much that bag weighs and then calculate the cost of the feed on a per pound basis. So a 40-pound bag of cubes was 38 cents a pound, and if you were feeding 15 pounds a day, that equated to $5.62 a day. Whereas hay, even at $5 a bale, which is kind of about what the price is here now, and I know some of you in Texas are probably laughing right now, and possibly Nebraska too. But this was about double, or we had been used to paying about $3 a bale. At $5 a bale, that was 10 cents a pound, or $1.50 per day. So you can see that the difference is pretty big. But by the time we got to February, we were getting closer to the $12 to $15 range, and it started to make some sense. So looking then at other ways to stretch your hay and forage supply, another way to do that is through feeding complete feeds. And you want to make sure to look at the label because a true complete feed contains 16% or more fiber. They're typically, it'll say something on the bag along the lines of designed to be fed without forage, and they're typically a mixture of grain, hay or beet pulp, vitamin and mineral mixes, your senior feeds, some of the junior formulations may actually be complete feeds, but a lot of the senior feeds are. So especially, again, for the older horses that maybe struggle with long stem forage, a combination of cubes and these complete feeds can help those horses do well. So when you feed complete feeds, you want to make sure that you adjust the grain accordingly as well. So the typical recommendation, if it's 12 to 15 pounds a day for a 1,000-pound horse, you want to divide it up into, especially at the 15-pound rate, more frequent small amounts, not 2 7.5-pound feedings. That's more, that 7.5 pounds at a feeding is probably more than a horse should take in at a given time. So you'll want to spread that over the course of the day with the complete feeds. So the benefits to complete feed is, again, you have that increased fiber, and fiber is an important part of keeping a horse healthy. This is not as ideal as long stem forage in a lot of ways, but some horses will do very well with a combination of the complete feed, or you can use the complete feed to try to stretch your hay supply. But they're typically formulated to meet a specific horse's needs, and they're typically designed to be fed without hay, grain, or other supplements. So in theory, you could feed a horse just a complete feed with very little long stem forage. If you have access to long stem forage, you might still want to do a little bit of that, just from the chew factor that we talked in the beginning. If you do switch over to complete feeds, you want to make the switch gradually. Again, you want to feed several meals, maybe a breakfast, lunch, and dinner, for lack of a better way to describe it. You don't necessarily want to feed a full additional grain supply, but definitely read the label. But again, with this type of diet that would be limited in long stem forage, that might increase your instances of wood chewing. If you switch them over too quickly, you may also have an increased risk of colic or laminitis. And again, while this provides some fiber in the diet, it is more like grain in many ways. So as we talked about the small intestine in the beginning and how long stem forage can open that up a little bit, these sorts of feeds might not have that same benefit. From a cost perspective, it's still more costly than a 50-pound bale of hay at $5 a bale, but it may work in places where hay is much more expensive than that. This is just an example, an economic example. I make no claims in regards to this particular brand of feed, but at the time I was looking, this particular feed was $14.50 for a 50-pound bag, which wound up being about $4.35 a day. Again, if you remember, the $5 hay was $1.50 a day, but there was also another formulation that was $17.99 a bag, which was $5.40 per day. Some of the other things that are coming on the scene, and I haven't seen this particular product yet, at least in our area, but it may be in your area, is a total mixed ration, which has already been fed for years in dairy, but is starting to be formulated for horses. It's similar to dog food, and it is consumed more slowly than other complete feeds because of they're formulated, or it's formulated more in biscuits, and the biscuits are bigger. You feed 2% of your horse's body weight, and up to this point, there seems to be some benefit to these, but most of the work has been done with young horses. But as we go forward and as we continue to have some questionable growing seasons, we may see more of this kind of product in your feed store shelves. And maybe some of you have fed these. I'm not sure. I guess if you have, by all means, share that in the chat. And Helen had shared that in Western Washington, hay can be 20 pounds or more per 60 or 70-pound bale. And we were similar. I mean, we were close to that last winter, especially on a per pound basis, but we are definitely better now than we were. And Laura says, I'd like to check into this. Could you do a mix of these and hay? That probably, again, I don't have a lot of information in regards to this product other than to know that last year when we were looking at other options, this was one that was starting to come on the market. But I think if you were going to feed these, it would be best to try to formulate it. Whenever you can feed long stem forage, that's always a good idea. But you want to balance your diet. I mean, you don't want them to get obese or anything like that. But a combination of these and long stem forage would probably be a good option. Other things you can do to try to stretch your hay supply include fiber byproducts. So these things would be used primarily as a fiber source. So not anything you would feed alone. Certainly not things that provide much in the way of nutrient, but more fiber and chew factor for the most part to kind of stretch that hay supply out as you need to. And we'll talk about each of these individually, but they include straw, beet pulp, wheat bran, rice bran, and some other things as well. So straw is the stalks or the leftover from harvesting wheat and other grains. It is typically gold in color, and it doesn't look like hay at all. I've seen some pretty poor quality hay that was extremely mature when it was cut and then was bleached or something that may look a little bit like it, but straw is definitely much different from hay. It can provide a good source of fiber though, and it does give horses something to chew on. There was a time when we bedded horses almost exclusively on straw, and if you're still involved in the breeding business or you have brood mares, it's still pretty common to foal mares out on straw. But they have to have another nutrient source if you're using a little bit of straw to try to extend the fiber, because it doesn't provide much in the way of the nutrients like protein and energy and vitamins and minerals and the things that horses need or anyone would need. It mostly just provides something to chew and some fiber to open the tract up to some extent. If you feed too much of it, or if the horse consumes too much of it, you have the potential to increase the risk of impaction colic because it is extremely fibrous. So they can eat some, but they're not going to be able to digest it terribly well or terribly effectively because it is so fibrous. So you wouldn't want more than I would say less than probably 10% of the diet as straw. So and that would I would be extremely cautious with using straw, but you could do it to some extent. Um, Beet pulp is another product that we use pretty extensively in the Midwest anyway, as an additional fiber source, and it has been used for years. It's a byproduct of the sugar beet industry, but surprisingly, it's actually pretty low in sugar. It's actually also low in protein, about 8%, but it's an excellent source of protein. It's high in calcium. The recommendation typically is that it be soaked. There's increased potential for choke and potentially other blockages when it's not soaked, but it comes in multiple forms. So as you can see here, um, we have flakes, pellets, and crumbles. And you can feed up to 10 pounds roughly a day, but it wouldn't necessarily be the sole source. And Helen says that she has heard of studies relating beet pulp to laminitis. Are you suggesting an increase in laminitis because people have fed beet pulp? Is that what you're hearing? Okay. And I mean, I know people who have fed it very successfully without having an increase in laminitis, but again, it's not, they don't feed large quantities of it. So um, it would be 10 pounds, up to 10 pounds in the course of a day, but not more than that. And that would be 10 pounds dry, Fred. So, not more than if you're feeding twice, you certainly wouldn't want more than 5 pounds in the morning and 5 pounds in the evening. But we already feed quite a bit of beet pulp in our regular, a lot of our processed bagged feeds already have beet pulp in them. So this is just increasing it a bit as a form of increasing the fiber source. Another source of fiber that people commonly feed or may feed is wheat bran. And if you have read Black Beauty, I believe I haven't read it in a long time, but I seem to recall a bran mash. And bran mashes are fairly or were fairly common in the horse industry. And it's basically wheat bran and hot water. And it isn't anything that really should be fed in large quantities for extended periods. It's extremely high in phosphorus. And so if you have young horses that are under about 4 that are still developing bone, when your phosphorus ratio in the diet is higher than your calcium ratio, you're at risk of bone problems. So you wouldn't want to feed this daily necessarily, but at levels lower than 1 pound per day. In a mature horse, it's probably not going to cause a problem, but it's really more of a treat or in the form of a mash than anything. It does stimulate the GI tract to some extent, so it can be helpful in that regard, but it isn't anything necessarily that you would want to use as a sole source of fiber. Rice bran is kind of a similar product. It's fairly common or was fairly common in the horse world about 10 years ago or a little more than that to feed rice bran. It's a good source of fat, a reasonable source of fiber, but again, it isn't going to provide a ton of fiber. It's higher in phosphorus than wheat bran even. So again, you would want to be very cautious in feeding it to your young horses. When people feed rice bran anymore, most commercial rice bran products for horses have been balanced for calcium. So you're less apt to get into those problems related to bone growth and bone development. But it does provide a good source of fat and will put hence more energy into the diet, and it's commonly used to enhance coat condition in that respect. It's also possible to feed corn stalks or corn stover. You do have to be very careful in feeding the corn stalks or corn stover. It will add fiber to the diet, but if there's still cobs in the field and the horses consume the corn, that could increase risk of laminitis for sure. So you want to make sure that there's limited seed corn in the field. It works better if the corn stover or stalks are actually chopped because, again, you have that increased potential for impaction colic. But they can also go out into the field, provided there's limited seed corn out there, and for periods over the course of the day, consume some of that. It works very, very well in beef cattle. I would certainly proceed with caution with horses, but I know we had some draft horse producers, especially in our area, that did some of that last year to, again, just try to stretch the hay supply some. So it can certainly be done. Moving on then to some other considerations or ways to be cautious with your hay supply. Using mats and feeders is one way that you can limit waste. And so you certainly would want to take that into consideration. I know sometimes horses will pull hay out of the feeder and drop it on the ground. No one seemed to tell them that there was a hay shortage or a problem with the price of hay. But a lot of times mats and feeders will limit some of that waste. Also weighing hay to determine how much is really needed and rationing it accordingly can be beneficial when you're in the time when you're trying to be careful how much hay you use. Round bales are also a very cost-effective way to feed horses, both if you have larger numbers of horses, so 7 plus in a particular field, eating off a particular bale, depending on your weather and where you are. I know in Washington State this may not work as well, but usually horses can consume a round bale. That number of horses can consume a round bale before it actually does get moldy. And I know there's people in the horse industry are often very concerned about feeding round bales because of the mold issue, but a lot of times that's related to the weather. So a 4x5 round bale weighs about 700 pounds. And the other thing you're going to need is the equipment to use to move round bales, and not every horse owner has access to that. But last year, we were definitely encouraging people to maybe get with your neighbors that did have heavy equipment that could move round bales for you, or help with the storage of round bales, because that can be an issue too. But last year, almost at this time, we had round bales that were about 55 pounds a bale, which was $1.28 per horse per day, which it was substantially lower than the $1.50 or the $1.50 per horse per day that we were looking at with the 50-pound squares. And the other thing to keep in mind with the 50-pound squares is that 50-pound square bales of hay are about the most labor-intensive means of making hay possible. And once upon a time, we seem to have a large contingent of teenagers that were willing to go out in the 100-degree heat and help bale 50-pound bales and produce hay in that regards. But those folks seem to have disappeared for some reason. So more and more hay producers in our area, anyway, are going to round bales. I know horse people get concerned again about feeding those, but it's also possible if you've got the storage space to either cut hay off the round bale, or even better, we have large squares that are even easier to cut hay off of. But that way you can cut it off the bale, weigh it, and feed it off the round bale if you don't want to keep the round bale outside, or you don't have the means to do that. But again, it does require some storage and equipment. It's definitely cost effective. You'll want to keep a close eye on your round bale to see what's in the hay. We've had, and some of you may also be familiar with the weed Horiolisum, but it's fairly endemic in Michigan at this point. It's a long stem weed that has little nodules that look kind of like pearls on the stem, and it has a white flower at the top. And it tends to take over when pastures have been drought stressed or really been eaten down. Some horses can consume Horiolisum okay without a lot of problems, and others are extremely sensitive to it, and it may result in colic and founder, potentially, and in certain cases when horses are extremely sensitive, death, usually as a result of those other conditions. But you'll want to keep or look closely at what you're feeding and make sure that you don't have issues like horiolism. Other options as far as stretching the hay supply can include things, and I'll get to your question in just a sec, Kim, are things called slow feeders, which are really hay bags or nets, and there are also other designs. So boxes that you can put a bale of hay in with a piece of grate or hog panel over the top of it. It actually then takes the horses longer to consume the hay, which can, like we talked about in the beginning, if they eat it quickly, their stomach is empty longer and it may increase the risk of ulcers. But if they eat it over a period of time, because they have to work a little harder to get it, it'll take them longer to consume the hay. And that's why, or they're able, to maintain a healthier GI tract potentially. But it doesn't necessarily change the amount they need to consume overall. It just means they eat what they have more slowly. So don't misunderstand the slow feeding concept in regards to that means I can feed less hay. It doesn't necessarily. It just means it'll take them longer to consume it. And it looks like Dr. Skelly has addressed Kim's question, so I will go ahead and move on. Actually, I'm moving on to the end. So with that, I would entertain any questions you might have. I, again, appreciate My Horse University having me, and we'll just go from there. And Fred has indicated that most extension offices have access to a hay testing lab, so that might help both from a hay quality perspective and with Kim's question just a little bit. Do we have any other questions? Looks like Kim and Barry are both typing. Barry says we're experiencing significant drooling, or slobbers is also what that's called. Fungi and clover in the pasture, probably so. And sometimes you can have, it's typically, well, not always red clover, but it typically depends a little bit on the growing season, but it's usually clover that causes the slobbers or the drooling, like you're mentioning. The best way to deal with it truly is to take the horses off the pasture if you can, or off the clover. You may also try to modify or feed more grass hay or something in that regard, and then limit their time on the pasture if you can. But it's definitely the clover, I would guess. Looks like Kim and Dr. Skelly are discussing the hay sampling yet. And Dr. Skelly mentions horse quality to some people means low quality. I like to feed medium quality to mid bloom to horses. They'll experience less waste because they eat it all. Yep. Barry's provided some information. We were buying first cutting at about $4 a 50-pound bale, going up to $5 for third cutting. And Barry, that's exactly what I paid this year too. $4 for first cutting and $5 to $5.50 for second cutting. We don't have a lot of third cutting in Michigan, but we're at about the same place cost-wise. Oh, multiple attendees are typing now. This is good. Dr. Skelly mentioned that the costs will continue to go up and will be high in February. It definitely will. We'll want to, that's part of why, if you can, either contract it now or buy as much as you can now as opposed to waiting till February. In talking with USDA Farm Service folks in Michigan anyway, they don't think it'll go up as dramatically as it did last year, but it will maintain or continue to be pre 2011. It won't be pre 2011 prices probably this year for sure, but it probably also won't be as high as last year, at least in this area. Helen says, we've been experiencing increased laminitis in Western Washington with the richer pastures using grass types intended for fattening cattle. So a lot of folks are feeding teff hay. Do you have this issue in Michigan, and do you have teff hay out there? We do have teff grass. We haven't had a lot of people feeding it to horses necessarily. We also, even at the Michigan State Teaching and Research Center, we have very, very rich pastures at certain times of year, especially in the spring and quite possibly again in the fall at times. And what we do in those circumstances is bring the horses into dry lots for part of the day so they don't continuously graze those rich pastures during those periods. And also even just feeding, as opposed to richer grasses, just straight grass like orchard grass or timothy, and some of those varieties can be beneficial for some horses that maybe are, that it's typically alfalfa and some of those sorts of things that are going to increase the energy and protein in a diet and ultimately may result in laminitis for some horses. It's usually not the grass species, but then again, when some horses become sensitive to sugar content, there is some grass that is higher in sugar content, and tough grass tends to be lower. We just don't have a lot of people doing it yet. Barry mentions, you referenced wood chewing several times. Our horses are definitely chewing on tree bark and fence posts. Is this harmful? It isn't great if you can limit it. Depends on the tree bark. In some cases, especially trees like black walnut and red maple, that can be harmful. But more than that, I guess I would be concerned, depending on how much they're doing it, about impaction colics. But at the same time, we have young horses here at Michigan State that spend more time than they should, sometimes, especially in the winter when there is no grass, chewing on fence posts, and we haven't run into a lot of problems per se. It's not great for your trees. It will definitely kill the trees. So if you can fence those off, that can be helpful. But you know, it isn't an ideal situation. But at the same time, I've not heard of anyone directly being able to say my horse colicked because it chewed on the fence post per se. Looks like Dr. Skelly is responding to the cubes and pellets questions. Rachel says, I've seen Horiolism in the hay where I work. The owner is not educated on horses at all. I'm not sure what to say about this problem now. Horiolism is especially an issue in hay because especially horses that are consuming hay in a stall, because in the pasture, if there's horiolism, they'll eat around it. I mean, we have videos of them eating grass around horiolism and skipping the horiolism altogether. So if they have something better, they'll make that choice. But in hay, that's what they've got. So depending on the percentage of horiolism in the hay, that is potentially a problem, and I guess I would let the owner know that. If you recognize the plant, you can pull it out or if it's a very low percentage, it's probably all right. But if it's over 30%, it's definitely cause for concern, and you would want to address that because it can be. I mean, we have a horse that's rehabilitating at the MSU farm now that consumed Horalicum, and actually there were several horses that became very, very ill. If it's over 30%, I would. Have you been feeding it for very long? And they're doing okay so far? It must be. I kind of missed, can horses be fed corn stover silage? I would have to look more at that as well. So I guess I don't feel quite comfortable answering that. Yeah, there'd be some potential other issues with silage that could be problematic. Okay, so some bales are better than others. Yeah, I mean, it certainly could be an issue. Um, if you can try to feed the good bales and talk to your owner about the others, I would do that. I'd like to be able to say it's no big deal, but unfortunately, I really can't say that. Yeah, Chris had mentioned that there's a vaccine for botulism, which is one of the big concerns with feeding horses silage, that you can give horses that might be at high risk, and that does happen and is a possibility. I just don't have enough experience feeding corn silage to horses or corn stover silage. I would have to look more at it. All right, well, our questions have slowed down, so thank you, everyone. And hopefully, I think Gwen probably has some final comments for us, and I will hopefully see you again sometime.
Right. Thank you, Karen. We'd like to definitely thank you for being our presenter this evening. This was definitely a very educational webcast, and I'm sure we've all learned a lot from this evening in terms of helping to feed our horses a little bit better. And of course, also, we'd like to thank our participants tonight. You guys have been great. You've asked a lot of really good questions, which makes it fun as well. You will be receiving a survey by email in the next week or so, and we hope you take a few minutes to give us your feedback on the webcast. We will actually have the recording from this webcast up on our website tomorrow, so that will be up right away. Just to give you a little bit of insight to some webcasts that we have coming up. In October, we're still finalizing a date, but that webcast is going to be on winter care for your horses, and as soon as we have a date, we will let people know. In November, we've got Dr. Ann Swinker from Penn State University. She's going to be speaking on November 26th about arena footing. And then in December, we're going to be having a webcast on managing extreme weights in horses. So we've got some good ones coming up, and we'll let you know the details as soon as we get things finalized. One last thing I would like to let everyone know is that Chris mentioned that she's going to be putting this webcast in our nutrition course, and we are having a 50% discount on our course, on our nutrition course, I should say, this month. And so the coupon code is HN50. You could use that to receive a 50% discount on the course if you would like. And finally, please make sure to join My Horse University on Facebook and Twitter for information on events, courses, and more. And feel free to send any comments or suggestions to info@myhorseuniversity.com. So I'd like to thank everyone, and we hope you all have a great night, and we hope to see you next month. And yes, thank you, Chris.